Hi, I'm Emma, your AI narrator. Over the next 24 sessions, we're going to work through some of the most important and most overlooked questions in organizational leadership today. Here's the one that sits at the center of everything we'll cover. How does an organization honestly know whether it can do what it says it can do? Not in a presentation, not in an audit, in the conditions that actually arise. Most organizations answer that question with documents. Policies, control frameworks, risk registers, compliance reports, dashboard summaries. That work is real and it matters. But documentation is not the same as demonstrated capability. And the gap between them, between what the paperwork says and what the system actually does under pressure, is where the most costly failures happen. This series is about closing that gap. We'll start with something most leaders already sense but rarely say out loud. That green dashboards can coexist with genuinely fragile operations. That an organization can be fully compliant on paper and still be surprised by what it cannot do when it counts. That more controls, more reports, and more frameworks do not automatically produce more resilience. From there, we'll build towards something better. A way of governing that is grounded in evidence of real capability, not assembled confidence. A model that connects what leadership intends, what the organization measures, and what people actually do so that those three things reinforce each other rather than drift apart. Along the way, we'll look at what this means for managers, executives, boards, risk and audit professionals, and regulators. Each role has a different vantage point. Each one has a part to play in making governance work as a system rather than a collection of separate disciplines. Every session follows a chapter. Each chapter builds on the last. By the end, you'll have a complete picture of what it looks like when governance, resilience, assurance, and accountability operate together, and a practical path for getting there in your own organization. The work starts in Chapter 1. Let's go. Here's a scenario that may feel familiar. You're heading into an important meeting. Every dashboard you've checked is green. Uptime is solid. The security scan came back clean. Controls are mapped to the major industry standards. The board pre-brief practically wrote itself. On paper, it looks like a perfect day. Then, just as the meeting wraps up, something starts to go wrong. Not a dramatic crash, just a slow creeping failure in a payment flow. Customers are frustrated. Partners are sending escalation emails. Social media is picking up the noise. And someone asks the question you were hoping never to hear. If everything was green, why did this happen? That is the illusion of comfort. The dashboards weren't lying exactly. They were measuring real things. But they were measuring proxies, stand-ins for the outcomes that actually matter. And proxies can stay green even while the system that serves your customers quietly degrades. This session is about that gap. The space between what your governance tools report and what your organization can actually do under pressure. Let's start by looking at what made that day look so good, and why it wasn't. So what made that dashboard look so reassuring? Uptime targets exceeded. 0 critical vulnerabilities. NIST CSF and ISO 27001 mapped and confirmed. The board pre-brief ready to go. Every one of those signals had real meaning. Platforms were available, security hygiene measures had been put in place, and the paperwork reflected what the organization had committed to do. But here is the word that matters: proxies. A proxy is a stand-in for the thing you actually care about. Training completion rates are a proxy for whether people know what to do under pressure. Control coverage percentages are a proxy for whether controls actually work in practice. Framework mappings indicate whether the organization can respond to the threats those frameworks describe. The problem isn't that proxies are useless. The problem is that they can stay green even as something genuinely important like a customer payment flow starts to fall apart at the edges. The dashboards told a story about the system as designed. They said nothing about how the system behaved where real customers were actually transacting. And as we'll see next, that gap between the design and the edge is exactly where failures live. Think of it as an iceberg. Above the waterline, you can see the clean surface. Uptime metrics, security hygiene scores, procedural compliance reports. These reflect the system's design intent, what governance teams said it should do, and how they said it should behave. Below the waterline is something different. the lived experience of the system at its edges. Complex transaction flows, API handoffs between services. Human decisions are made under time pressure. Supplier behaviors that don't quite match what the contracts specify. Dashboards measure what's above the waterline. Failures happen below it. This is the proxy disconnect. Scam-based security hygiene provides visibility into known vulnerabilities at a given point in time. It tells you nothing about whether an attacker could move through a trusted supplier update channel without triggering a single alert. Uptime metrics confirm the platform is running. They don't confirm that the workflow it supports is handling edge cases the way anyone intended. Proxies provide reassurance about the design. They provide no evidence of how the system actually functions at its edges, and that distinction matters enormously when something starts to go wrong. So how did we build a governance model so focused on the surface? That's what we'll look at next. This situation didn't happen because someone made a bad decision. It happened because of 2 decades of reasonable decisions that compounded into a structural problem. Every time a new regulation appeared, organizations added a layer of controls. Every time a major incident hit the headlines elsewhere, risk teams added requirements. Every time an auditor asked a question nobody could answer cleanly, someone built a process to make sure it could always be answered. Risk taxonomies, control catalogs, heat maps, framework mappings, single-pane dashboards promising total visibility. Each addition made sense on its own. No single decision was wrong. But over time, they merged into what we can call a governance overlay, a thick layer of documentation and reporting that sits on top of the real system rather than being woven into it. The overlay and the real system now speak different languages and serve different audiences. The overlay was built to answer questions from auditors, regulators, and boards. The real system, where APIs connect, cloud services operate, engineers make judgment calls, and attackers probe for weaknesses, keeps evolving at a pace the overlay cannot match. The gap between them is structural, and as we'll see in a real-world example, that gap can be exploited in ways that no checklist will catch. In 2020, the SolarWinds Orion attack gave the world one of the clearest illustrations of this problem. SolarWinds had real governance in place. Policies were documented. SOC reports were filed. Attestations were signed. The paper overlay was functioning exactly as designed. But the attack didn't come through any channel that the overlay was built to monitor. Attackers compromised a routine software update pipeline, a trusted channel that delivered updates from a vendor to thousands of customers. That pipeline ran with privileged access. It wasn't treated as a security boundary needing close oversight, because it was assumed to be safe by definition. The governance overlay measured coverage and conformance. Nobody had established evidence loops tied to a more pointed question. Can we detect abuse of a supplier update channel quickly, contain it, and prove end-to-end integrity? The boundary that mattered was bypassed entirely, not because a control was missing from a checklist, but because the checklist wasn't asking the right question about the right boundary. The lesson isn't that SolarWinds failed at governance in any simple sense. The lesson is this: governance without evidence at the boundary is reassurance, not assurance. Reassurance tells you the design looks right. Assurance means you have verified it works in practice. Those are very different things, and the difference shows up most clearly when 2 systems are speaking entirely different languages. And that brings us to a fundamental tension sitting at the heart of most governance failures. The governance overlay speaks the language of conformance. Are we aligned with the major standards? What percentage of controls are implemented? How many audit findings remain open? Which business units sign their quarterly certifications? These aren't useless questions. Regulators need them. External auditors need them. Boards need them as a baseline. But underneath the overlay, the real system speaks an entirely different language, the language of survival and speed. Engineers bypass change processes when they believe a slow approval will cause an outage. Product managers push the boundaries of acceptable risk to make a launch window. Supplier teams improvise controls that aren't in the contract because the contract language doesn't align with their operational reality. Exceptions get pushed through just before quarter end because the alternative is missing a deadline. None of those behaviors is irrational. Each one makes sense from the perspective of the person doing it. Collectively, they create an organization where the surface tells a coherent story for external audiences, while the underlying system is living a very different one. That gap, between the language of conformance and the language of survival, is where most governance failures actually originate. Not in a missing control, in the space between what the documents say and what the people do. And that gap didn't appear overnight. The gap between the governance overlay and the real system opened gradually, and understanding why it opened is what points toward closing it. Digital work has evolved exponentially. The speed at which code ships, systems change, cloud configurations update, and threats emerge today would have been unimaginable when many of today's governance practices were designed. A single customer transaction now crosses dozens of microservices. A supplier configuration change can cascade through your environment before a single internal committee has convened. Governance evolved linearly. Committees, approval gates, annual framework assessments, single-pane dashboards. Each step was a genuine improvement, but each one responded to the last problem rather than keeping pace with the current one. Organizations tried to close that gap with visibility tools. If everything is visible, the reasoning went, then everything can be managed. But visibility is only half the equation. The other half is how visibility changes behavior. A dashboard that shows a declining metric doesn't automatically change what an engineer does at 2 a.m. during a production incident. This structural drift, where digital complexity outpaced governance capacity, is the root cause of the situation many organizations now find themselves in. It isn't a failure of intent. It is a failure of pace. And it tends to show up in 3 specific habits that are worth naming directly. When you look carefully at organizations where green dashboards coexist with fragile operations, 3 habits tend to appear together. The first is treating coverage as an outcome. When a control is mapped to every relevant framework requirement, the sense of completeness can feel like a form of protection. We are mapped, therefore we are safe becomes the unspoken logic. But framework alignment describes design intent, not operational effectiveness. A mapped control that nobody follows protects nothing. The second is focusing on what's easy to measure rather than what matters. Training completion rates are easier to track than whether people actually change their behavior under pressure. Audit finding closure rates are easier to count than the extent to which underlying vulnerabilities have been genuinely addressed. Over time, the organization optimizes for the metrics it measures, not the outcomes those metrics were meant to approximate. The third habit is the most dangerous. Decisions become divorced from evidence. Governance committees decide. Engineers act. Analysts report. But those 3 activities happen in separate rooms on separate schedules, with no reliable connection between a specific decision and the measure that would later reveal whether it was wise. When all 3 habits combine, you get an organization that looks mature on its dashboards while remaining constantly on the verge of the next unpleasant surprise. And by the time leaders start to doubt their dashboards, certain patterns are usually already visible. By the time leaders start doubting their own dashboards, recognizable patterns are usually already present, if you know where to look. The first is the recurring ghost. The same integration service or supplier relationship keeps appearing in incident reviews. Root causes vary slightly. Action items get closed, but the pattern keeps coming back. The system is telling you something the paperwork isn't capturing. The second is the deadline surge. For most of the quarter, the formal change process appears to be working. Then, as a major deadline approaches, exception waivers spike. Temporary approvals become routine. The process was sustainable until the stakes got high enough, which means it was never truly sustainable at all. The third is the silent room. Steering committee meetings are well attended and beautifully organized. Slides are polished. But the people closest to the actual work rarely push back on assumptions or raise uncomfortable trade-offs. They've learned which topics are politically sensitive. Over time, curiosity in the room diminishes. The fourth is the orphan metric. Numbers trend in the wrong direction. Everyone comments on them, but no one can clearly say who owns the behavioral change needed to fix them. The metrics hover above the work rather than guiding it. These are not minor inconveniences. Each one is a signal that governance, measurement, and culture have become disconnected. And when leaders recognize these patterns, the instinct is usually to reach for familiar solutions, which is where the next trap waits. When these patterns become visible, the natural response is to reach for what has worked before. Incidents recurring? Add more verification steps. Exceptions spiking? Tighten approvals and require dual signatures. Dashboards unclear? Redesign them with sharper thresholds. Each response sounds reasonable in isolation, but used without addressing the underlying problem, they can make things worse. Adding more verification steps without connecting them to learning just adds operational noise. People complete the steps to satisfy the checklist. The system doesn't improve. Tightening approvals may reduce the incidents you can see. It also increases pressure to work around the process, pushing risky decisions underground, where they're even harder to detect. Redesigning the dashboard changes the colors on the screen. It doesn't change what engineers do during a 2 a.m. incident. The incentives are the same. The behavior is the same. Only the display is different. The underlying issue is not a lack of policies, controls, or metrics. The issue is the absence of something that connects three things: the outcomes leadership actually wants, the measures that represent those outcomes in practice, and the behaviors and decisions that move those measures over time. Traditional governance tools provide important pieces of that picture. What they often lack is the connective tissue that keeps all three in alignment as the environment changes. That connective tissue has a name, and it looks like a loop. A healthier model is not a replacement for what you have. It's a living feedback loop that connects three elements and keeps them continuously informing each other. The first is governance intent, the operational outcomes leadership actually wants to achieve. Not policies and not framework mappings, but specific statable outcomes. What does it mean for this payment flow to be reliable? What does it mean for this data boundary to be trustworthy? Intent has to be concrete before it can be measured. The second is measures, the real-world signals tied to those outcomes in practice. Not training completion rates or audit finding counts, but evidence tied to actual boundary behavior. Does the payment flow recover within the defined window? Is the data boundary maintaining integrity under the actual transaction load? The third is behaviors and decisions, the daily actions of engineers, managers, and operators that actually move those measures. Not what the policy says people should do, what they actually do when a deadline is close and a process feels like friction. Traditional governance provides components of this loop. What it typically lacks is the connective tissue. The mechanisms that ensure intent shapes measures, measures guide behaviors, and behaviors feed back into refined intent as the system learns from experience. Building that connective tissue is the work ahead. That question is this: are we running a system we can depend on, or are we producing evidence that we are trying to? On one side sits assembled confidence. Policies documented, controls mapped, checklists completed, attestations signed. It looks right. It tells the right story to auditors and boards. And it provides real comfort, the comfort of having done what was expected. On the other side sits demonstrated capability, evidence drawn from real operations under real conditions that the system performs as claimed. Not in a controlled assessment, in the conditions that actually arise. Checklists and attestations still have their place. They represent genuine work and genuine commitment. But they are not the same as verified capability. The gap between them, between what documentation says and what the system does under real pressure, is where the most costly failures occur. Every organization in this program is somewhere on the spectrum between assembled confidence and demonstrated capability. Most are closer to the left side than they would like to admit. That's not a moral failing. It's a structural condition that can be changed. The sessions ahead will show how. We'll look at what governance needs to become, how to connect it to the work that actually happens at your boundaries, and what it takes to build an organization that can honestly say it knows what it can do, not just on paper but in practice. That shift starts in the next session.